A couple of months ago, I made a video discussing the fate of Voldemort after his final defeat in the Deathly Hallows. And although Voldemort's death looks fairly different from book to film, disintegrating into 1,000 pieces in the films and simply falling to the ground with mundane finality in the books, one thing remained the same. Voldemort's soul was completely and utterly destroyed. And unquestionably, this was due to his pursuit of Horcruxes. By repeatedly tearing his soul apart, splitting it again and again in the name of immortality, Voldemort ensured that when death finally came for him, there was simply nothing whole left to survive it. And his soul, repeatedly mutilated beyond recognition, was incapable of moving on, forcing him to remain a broken fragment trapped in a state of eternal limbo. But here's the thing. Although creating Horcruxes is a surefire way to destroy the state of your soul, it's important to remember that it's not the only way. And this brings into question the fate of some of the other characters in this series, in particular a character with a fairly dubious past, Albus Dumbledore. Today we'll be unpacking the fate of our favourite Hogwarts headmaster post-mortem, in an effort to see whether Dumbledore's end was truly as peaceful as it first appears. Let's dive into it. Hey everyone, welcome to another installment of Harry Potter Theory. Before we dive too far into this, the first thing I'd like to touch on are the circumstances surrounding Dumbledore's death, because it was nothing like Voldemort's. Long before he ever stepped onto the astronomy tower, Dumbledore knew exactly how and when he would die, and more importantly, who would be responsible. He arranged the circumstances, accepted the curse already consuming him, and chose to meet death on his own terms. Snape raised his wand and pointed it directly at Dumbledore. Avada Kedavra! A jet of green light shot from the end of Snape's wand and hit Dumbledore squarely in the chest. Harry's scream of horror never left him, silent and unmoving. He was forced to watch as Dumbledore was blasted into the air. For a split second he seemed to hang, suspended beneath the shining skull, and then he fell slowly backwards, like a great rag doll, over the battlements and out of sight. And although Dumbledore effectively dies in this moment, his role in the story doesn't end there. Before we continue, I just want to mention that only 32% of you are subscribed, so if you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing to help support the channel. Posthumously, Dumbledore remains deeply involved in the events of Deathly Hallows, particularly when Harry is struck by Voldemort's killing curse in the Forbidden Forest. After Harry is struck, he finds himself in a liminal, dreamlike version of King's Cross Station. There, he encounters Dumbledore, who answers his questions and explains what has just happened. Dumbledore clarifies that the fragment of Voldemort's soul attached to Harry has been destroyed, that Harry himself remains alive, and that he now has a choice, to return to the living world or to move on. And during this exchange, Dumbledore behaves as he always has, measured, honest in places, evasive in others, and deeply concerned with Harry's understanding of events. This scene marks Dumbledore's first appearance after his death in Half-Blood Prince, and it seems to suggest that his soul remained intact. He's calm, composed, self-aware, and, most importantly, not mutilated, like Voldemort's remaining soul fragment. There's no indication of fragmentation, torment, or distortion, the kinds of effects we associate with severe damage to the soul elsewhere in the series. And if this encounter is meant to represent the state of Dumbledore's soul, then it paints a picture of a man who, despite his past mistakes, was able to face death whole. But that interpretation rests on one critical assumption, that what Harry experiences at King's Cross is an objective reality. And the text never actually confirms that. It's just meant to be interpreted as a mix of Harry's subconscious processing information and a genuine spiritual post-death encounter. Towards the end of their encounter, Harry even asks, "Tell me one last thing. Is this real, or has this been happening inside my head?" To which Dumbledore replies, "Of course it's happening inside your head, Harry, but why on earth should that mean that it's not real?" Rowling seems to deliberately leave the nature of this encounter ambiguous. Dumbledore himself tells Harry that the experience is happening inside of his head, while simultaneously insisting that this does not make it unreal. And if King's Cross is not a literal meeting with Dumbledore's soul, then we lose our only direct window into its condition after death, which of course means that we need to look elsewhere. In Harry Potter, the soul is not treated as a symbolic or philosophical concept. It's a real functional component of one's existence. Dementors feed on the soul rather than the body. Horcruxes are created by splitting and containing fragments of the soul, and the killing curse is widely understood to cause death by forcibly separating the soul from the body. The books also make clear that death does not automatically damage the soul. In ordinary circumstances, the soul departs intact, allowing whatever comes next, whether that's the afterlife, another plane of existence, or something undefined, to occur without interference. Soul damage, however, is possible. And while Voldemort might be the most extreme case of someone damaging their soul, namely through Horcruxes, it's important to remember that Horcrux creation is not the only mechanism by which the soul can be affected. And there are a few ways to damage the soul that stand out in particular, namely killing, drinking unicorn blood, and the sustained use of dark magic. In the books, Slughorn explains that the act of killing tears the soul apart, and that this damage occurs regardless of whether a Horcrux is created. In other words, the moment a wizard intentionally kills, their soul is damaged. Each subsequent killing compounds that damage, making the soul progressively weaker and more unstable. Beyond killing, the books strongly imply that prolonged use of dark magic also degrades the soul, even when it doesn't involve murder. Dark magic is consistently associated with internal corruption, and wizards who rely heavily on dark curses are often described as becoming less human over time, both psychologically and physically. And if we take a look at Dumbledore's past, it's very plausible that he crossed both of these lines. In his youth, Dumbledore was ambitious, intellectually arrogant, and deeply drawn to power. Following the deaths of his parents, he briefly embraced an ideology that placed wizardkind above muggles, believing that magical dominance could be justified for what he perceived as the greater good. This worldview culminated in his close relationship with Gellert Grindelwald, a partnership founded on this shared ambition. During this period of Dumbledore's life, he actively entertained ideas of magical supremacy and control, concepts that stand uncomfortably close to the philosophies later championed by Voldemort. And while Dumbledore may have never sought immortality or created a Horcrux, in his early years he was prepared, however briefly, to compromise ethical boundaries in service of greater magical ideals. This chapter of his life also ended in tragedy when a three-way duel between Dumbledore, Grindelwald, and Aberforth resulted in the death of his sister, Ariana, a loss that haunted him for the remainder of his life. And what's particularly worth noting here is that the text never confirms who cast the spell that killed her. In the books, Dumbledore even admits that he feared discovering the truth. This event marked a turning point in Dumbledore's life. He withdrew from positions of power, rejected the ministry, and spent decades attempting to atone for the mistakes of the past. But the fact remains, Dumbledore may have caused his sister's death, and it's just as likely that he practiced dark magic during a time in his life when moral restraint was secondary to ambition. And whether or not Dumbledore directly caused Ariana's death, if killing damages the soul regardless of intent, and if dark magic corrodes the self over time, then Dumbledore's early actions, his proximity to violence, his flirtation with Dominion, cannot be dismissed as morally neutral. They are part of his history, and potentially part of his soul's history as well. And if all of this is true, then perhaps Dumbledore's soul was not as squeaky clean as that limbo scene had led us to believe. And now the question is, what happens after that damage is done? Although damage to the soul is emphasized a fair bit throughout the books, they do also mention that the soul can be healed if the individual is committed enough. Harry remembered what Dumbledore had said about Voldemort moving beyond usual evil. "Isn't there any way of putting yourself back together?" Ron asked. "Yes," said Hermione with a hollow smile, "but it would be excruciatingly painful." "Why? How do you do it?" asked Harry. "Remorse," said Hermione. "You've got to really feel what you've done. There's a footnote. Apparently the pain of it can destroy you. I can't see Voldemort attempting it somehow. Can you?" And honestly, I'd characterize Dumbledore's life decisions after his youth as being defined almost entirely by remorse. From the moment Ariana died, Dumbledore's entire trajectory changes, And most importantly, Dumbledore never minimizes what he did. He doesn't justify his past, nor does he reframe it as a necessary mistake. Instead, he carries the weight of it for the rest of his life. And if remorse truly is the mechanism by which a damaged soul can be repaired, then Dumbledore is perhaps the clearest example in this series of someone who lived in a near constant state of it. Not performative regret, but a quiet, enduring reckoning that shaped every major decision he made thereafter. Interestingly, it's documented in the books that in some cases, when someone dies, their soul is actually vitalized or purified, reverting the individual back to their prime state. This is reinforced through Harry's interaction with the souls of his loved ones in the Forbidden Forest. Sirius was tall and handsome, and younger by far than Harry had seen him in life. He loped with an easy grace, his hands in his pockets and a grin on his face. Lupin was younger too, and much less shabby, and his hair was thicker and darker. He looked happy to be back in this familiar place, scene of so many adolescent wanderings. Now the question is, if Dumbledore's soul wasn't mutilated, then what happened to it? Death in the Wizarding World is not an end, but a transition. A soul freed from its body continues to exist somewhere else. According to Wizarding World lore, there are a few places you can go after death, the first of which is the afterlife. When Harry speaks with Nearly Headless Nick about death, Nick explains that becoming a ghost is a choice, and one that very few witches and wizards would make. His words strongly imply that there is another destination awaiting the dead, one that most consider preferable. The books never define the afterlife explicitly, but they do frame it consistently as the best possible outcome, a peaceful state where the soul exists in a purified form, released from suffering, fear, and regret. In this state, the soul appears restored, returned not to the moment of death, but to something closer to its prime. Presumably, this is where Harry's loved ones were when he summoned the Resurrection Stone. The next place you can go is Limbo. Limbo, in many religious traditions, is described as a threshold, a borderland between life and death, heaven and hell, a place where souls pause before moving on. And while interpretations vary across cultures, one idea remains consistent. Limbo is not where a soul is meant to remain. In the Harry Potter universe, Limbo serves a very specific purpose. It's a place of decision. A recently deceased soul may choose to move on, or, if they fear death too greatly, remain behind in the mortal world as a ghost. However, J.K. Rowling also later clarified that Limbo serves another function as well. It's also the place where souls damaged beyond repair can become trapped. This is Voldemort's fate. Because his soul was repeatedly fractured through Horcrux creation, he is unable to move on. The small whimpering creature Harry sees beneath the bench in King's Cross represents what remains of Voldemort's soul. Too broken to pass on, yet unable to return. And although Dumbledore appears in Limbo during Harry's near-death experience, I do think that Voldemort's fate also helps clarify what didn't happen to Dumbledore. When Harry speaks with Nearly Headless Nick, he learns that ghosts are not the souls of the dead in their entirety, but incomplete impressions, echoes left behind by witches and wizards who are unable or unwilling to move on. Basically, ghosts stick around when they have unfinished business. Before Harry ever encounters Dumbledore in Limbo, if it was indeed Limbo, he first uses the Resurrection Stone, and notably, Dumbledore doesn't appear. The purpose of the stone is to recall those who have passed beyond death, not souls lingering between states. Therefore, if Dumbledore had already entered the afterlife, there is no clear reason why the stone would be unable to summon him as well. This absence, then, helps explain Dumbledore's later appearance in the liminal King's Cross space. His soul had not yet fully moved on, not because he feared death, but because he still had a responsibility to fulfill. Dumbledore remained long enough to ensure that Harry understood the nature of his sacrifice, and crucially that the final choice would be Harry's alone, to return or to move on. So what do I think happened to Dumbledore's soul? I suspect that more than likely, Dumbledore's remorse and ability to confront his past behavior head-on was more than enough to fix his soul. I would argue that his completely intact soul in Limbo, which to answer Harry's question, I believe to be a real event, is a strong indication of this. And after helping Harry, it's entirely possible that Dumbledore simply moved on to the afterlife, along with some of Harry's other loved ones, finally realizing his purified state and being released from the cycle of death and rebirth. However, it is possible that Dumbledore never truly forgave himself for his actions in his youth, that instead of letting go and allowing himself to be embraced by eternal nirvana, he chose to return to the land of the living as a ghost, as atonement for his past behavior and involvement in Ariana's death. But again, what I think, a soul that was once tempted by power, burdened by guilt and shaped by loss, was finally allowed to move on whole. And that's it for this video. What do you think? Was Dumbledore's soul healed? Was he truly allowed to move on? Or did he choose a path of eternal penance? Let me know down in the comment section below. Also, if you enjoy the content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, remember, it does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live